everyone. Welcome to Between the Walls, the life of an in-house sound designer. Before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I'd also like to extend that respect to anyone joining us through the live stream or in the room who has a connection to the world's oldest continuing culture. My name's Jeannie Maxwell. I'm a curator at ACME and a writer, and I am the host of this panel, Between the Walls, the life of an in-house sound designer. On stage with me, we have a combined, we figured out, I think, 37 years of sound design experience, to which I contribute 0. But luckily, these three geniuses will be making that up for me. Little practical note, we're doing all of our questions through Slido, so if you're in the room, you can just scan the QR code on the back of your lanyard to submit questions or to upvote questions that you like. Feel free to submit them throughout the talk. We'll try to weave them in, keep things pretty chatty. I'm joined today by Anne-Marie Weber, who is the biggest contributor to the 17 years sound design. He's currently working on Thirsty Suitors with Outer Loop Games. Cedar Jones, who worked on Phantom Abyss and previously worked at Half Brick Studios. And Scott Boyd, who's sound designer on The Last Epoch at 11th Hour Games. I thought, given there is such a variety of expertise and such a depth of expertise, we could start a kind of fun question. What was the first project you worked on? It can be a musical project, it can be a game, it can be anywhere between the two. What was the most recent project you worked on, and what has been your favourite? Go on.
All right, so my first project, that would have been Ty the Tasmanian Tiger 3 at Chrome Studios. I would have been a junior sound designer on that. And then my most recent project would be the current one I'm working on right now, which is Thirsty Suitors.
Mine's not quite as cool as these guys, but so my first project was a little game called Ardenfall, which is like a sort of an Elder Scrolls style little low poly version of a game, just something really small, but yeah, it was a really good way to start and was a really good way to get started. And my most recent one is Last Epoch, which is like a Diablo sort of style ARPG, so working on that one with 11th Hour Games currently, yeah.
And my first project was The Legend of Spyro at Chrome Studios with Anne-Marie. About 1 year after Anne-Marie started. And my most recent was Jetpack Joyride 2 at Half Brick.
So when you look back to the beginning of your careers, whether that was 17 years ago or more recently than that, what was the norm back then, do you think, for audio and sound design? Was it more freelance, more in-house?
Oh, yeah, I would say like initially back then it was very much more in-house. There was still freelance back then, but the weighting was very much more different. It was a lot more traditional method of you get hired as a junior, you'd work your way up through the company, and that path is a lot more rare today. You probably only get that at big AAA studios now.
Yeah, I think our local scene had a lot more of those larger companies back then as well. And then it's obviously a bit of a different sort of situation these days where we have less of those big companies. So yeah, I'd say in-house was probably a lot more common back then, or the norm anyway, to start off.
Cool. Scott? No, I mean, I would love to hear your experience as someone who started your career a little bit more recently.
Yeah, okay, yeah, so from a little bit more of a recent perspective than these two, I think for me, I've seen a lot of, like Anne was saying before, there's a lot less opportunity in general for juniors. Unless you're going through that AAA pathway, there's still some of those roles, but it's a lot harder to break in at the moment, particularly in Australia. So what you'll find, I think, is a lot of people starting off freelancing and sort of learning on those smaller sort of projects, maybe doing indie projects, stuff like that, or coming from other places like music and getting some of those transferable skills, and then sort of moving into maybe a full-time role a little bit later in their careers.
Cool. Yeah. So I think all three of you have mixed, pardon? You warned me about drinking coffee. I did it anyway. I think all three of you have mixed in-house work with freelance projects over the course of your careers. What would you say is your preference at this point in your life, and why?
I probably prefer being freelance these days because every in-house studio I worked at shut down, and that was those were it happened 4 times, and each time was a pretty unpleasant experience. Now I kind of like being external. Also, you get to work on a larger variety of things, I think, and you've got a lot more freedom, I think, to make choices. Yeah, so I do actually quite like contracting as a freelancer, but I am very grateful for my in-house experience as well, though.
So you freelance with Outer Loop at the moment?
Yes, like I'm technically contract with them, so it feels like an in-house experience actually with that company. But yes, I contract with them, but I also contract with some other companies as well, like Spitfire Audio and among others.
Yeah, so for me, I guess I've done a little bit of both, but yeah, I prefer the in-house experience, so a little bit different there. But I've only had one studio shut down on me so far, so maybe that might change. We'll see. But yeah, I really enjoy the in-house. Like I think getting like to know the product sort of very intimately and getting very involved in the company's pipelines and things like that is really cool. Especially if you're trying to make like big changes for projects, like maybe introduce some really cool new technical features or something like that. Being in-house, you get a really good opportunity to sort of integrate with everyone else and talk with the other departments and make those changes happen a lot easier, I think, than freelance. And that's something I find a lot of pride in doing that sort of thing. So.
Yeah, I think I probably would agree with you, Scott. Throughout my career, I've been largely in-house the whole time. I've only really done little bits of freelancing by the good graces of the companies that I was in-house with at the time. However, I can really kind of see how there would be such a sense of flexibility when you're freelancing, and I think to have that as part of your career would, it's probably really important to have it in various ways throughout your career. I think the ideal is obviously a mixture of both, but that's kind of really completely cheating. So I would say for me it's in-house. Yeah, and for most of the reasons that you said, Scott, having a team that you work with, and especially if you're part of an audio team, can be fantastic just to have those people there for feedback and camaraderie and just teaching each other and learning from each other and all of that sort of stuff, I think is super, super valuable. And all the cultural benefits and stuff that comes with an in-house role as well, I suppose.
You worked at Half Brick for how long again?
12 years.
Yeah, very good. On titles like Jetpack Joyride 2, Fruit Ninja, many in between.
Yeah, there's been quite a few. They're the big ones, I guess. Yeah.
Could you talk me through the kind of in-house process there? I imagine it would have changed pretty significantly over those 12 years, but maybe in the last 4 or 5?
Yeah, sure. So in the last 4 or 5 years, it's become we've started. Well, I should say I'm not there anymore, but they've become very sort of focused on prototype type processes, which I think is really cool, and it's really kind of fostering a lot of creativity in there. So a lot of the work is in these early initial creative prototype type phases, and because of that, there's all these lots and lots of little teams that are working on these projects, and they kind of sometimes I think kind of run the whatever way suits them best. So there's quite a difference depending on which particular team that you'd be working with, and that was sort of my experience anyway. But yeah, prior to that, also obviously separate teams. So in terms of the process, there's a lot of collaboration with teams, and when you're working on more than one game at once, and I'm sure you guys have found this as well, often it'll be a bit of a juggling act, figuring out which meetings that you really need to be at and which teams you really need to collaborate with, and a lot of time management comes into that as well.
That makes sense. Scott, does that kind of speak to your experience at 11th Hour Games, or?
Yeah, cool.
Suppose
So
it's
11th Hour's been really good. There's this very small team of us at the moment. So there's a team of 3, so 2 sound designers, John Patter, who's based in Brisbane as well, and then we've got a composer as well, Eric DeCidro, who's over in America. So we're a fully global, fully remote studio. But yeah, I guess the in-house experience has been pretty good. I think the most valuable thing for me there is integrating with the other teams and stuff like that. So it's a really good it's a really good platform to be able to make the changes that you need to see in a game. So for those familiar with Diablo style ARPG games, there's a lot going on, right? So there's hundreds of enemies, hundreds of different things, got a bunch of different maps. They're very, very large games. And so what we realized was we were seeing sort of some holes in some of our audio coverage. So for instance, we'd paid a lot of attention to a lot of the combat and stuff like that. But our environment sort of details was sort of lacking a little bit. And so it's been really good to get in with some of the other programmers and stuff like that and come up with some systems and ways that we can, add those features in and get some really nice audio happening, like, utilizing splines for environmental audio, stuff like that, getting all those features custom built. And that's just something you probably wouldn't really be able to do as a freelancer. And so I've really enjoyed being part of the in-house team, doing that sort of work there. And it's been good.
Yeah, I think that's probably like the best, the best part of being in-house is that you're much more likely to have an audio team rather than be a solo audio dev. So like the thing I always miss the most when I'm contracting is I'm usually the only audio person on the team, but back when we were at Chrome or when I was at Sega, I had other audio professionals I could go to and I'd be like, hey, we play the build? Can I get a second opinion on something? We would do regular playthroughs. I'd walk away with like a big sheet of great notes on everything. And that's really hard to make that process happen when you're not in-house.
We were joking earlier that being kind of the only audio person on the project, you kind of pick your own title, like audio director of the Department of One. So it sounds like there are some pretty clear downsides to that, not having that kind of expert second opinion, not having people to bounce ideas off. But could you talk a little bit to the pros? Because I imagine there are some there too.
To not being in-house?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, well, people value your time a lot more. They don't waste your time on the dumb meetings that you don't really need to be at because they have to pay you to be at them. And yeah, you can say no to things as well, I think. It's really the same as any sort of freelance position, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, not too much to add, I guess. But yeah, you've got that extra sort of flexibility as a freelancer. Like you said, your time's not being wasted. They're paying for stuff like that. Perhaps maybe sometimes you can be a little bit removed from the project as well, which can help you sort of make a lot more logical decisions sometimes on things potentially. You're not as super attached to it necessarily. Yeah.
That's a really good point. I hadn't really thought of that. I would say for me too, and again, this is coming from, I suppose, an in-house perspective, but I think the freelance is really important for sort of taking control of your own career progression as well, which is something where maybe if you're in-house, you tend to, by its very nature, be a little bit tied to the progression and success or lack of success potentially of whatever company you're working for. And so when you're freelancing, you kind of, you have that power in your hands a lot more as well.
You sort of build your own brand instead of leeching the company's brand.
Yeah, and you get to build that up over time, right? Yeah.
Speaking of building a brand, I have a question here from the audience. If I've only done sound design in the context of music production, how would I start out making a reel or portfolio for sound design, I imagine for games specifically? Do you have any advice?
Answer that one, yeah. Awesome. Yeah, so that's exactly how I started. For those that don't know, I was a professional musician for about 10 years before I moved into sound design, or before I really discovered that sound design was a thing, which is awesome. But yeah, I guess the first thing that you need to do, you've got a lot of transferable skills there, right? Sound design and composition, they're very closely related, but they are two distinct disciplines, and they both take a lot of work and a lot of focus on working on that specific area of work. So the first thing I would suggest is focus on learning about sound design techniques and thinking as a sound designer first and foremost. After that, obviously, building a demo reel, that sort of thing, you need to learn DAWs, so like Ableton, Pro Tools, Reaper is a really good one. At the moment, very cheap, very flexible, used in a lot of game audio. So learn that inside out, and then just start building a demo reel. So you can use gameplay trailers or like clips of gameplay. So you can take those, edit them together, and just delete all the sound, get rid of everything, and then start from scratch, replacing it with your own audio, and trying to focus on getting that sounding as good as you can. Some other suggestions for that, I would also suggest trying to get some feedback as early as you can. It's very difficult to do if you're not used to it. It can be very you've got to be very vulnerable and open for that process to have people critique your work and say, potentially, oh, that sounds terrible. Hopefully they don't say that, but yeah. So try and do that as early as you can, and that's a very big part of sound design and improving. So that's where I'd start. Yeah.
Actually, I wonder if you could kind of talk a little bit more to your experience of sort of, I suppose, breaking into games as a sound designer. How did you get your first gig?
Yeah. So for me, I did pretty much exactly the process I just described, really. I put together a demo reel. I got it as good as I could. I sought out as much feedback as I could online. Places like Discord, Slack, there's a lot of different sound design groups you can go on, you can find. A lot of game audio is very, very generous with their time and their feedback, so you'll find very experienced people that are willing to critique your stuff and give you feedback as someone who's just starting. So take full advantage of that is my advice. Use that as much as you can. Learn as much as you can as early as you can and get your stuff sounding good and your processes down really nicely. From there, I sort of started reaching out to a couple of different game development groups that I was a part of, and they might have been posting sort of small, low-paying work or unpaid work with profit share or something like that occasionally. Yeah, and I just started building my portfolio through those pieces. So very small things, starting very small, and then gradually building up and up. And eventually I got to the place where I had enough sort of basic experience that I was very fortunate. I got an internship with a company here in Australia, Kapow Audio. Michael Thiele was very, very, very generous to take me on and taught me a lot there. So I'm very thankful for that. And I just used that as another stepping stone, more freelance work, and then eventually that led to an in-house role.
Was working in-house always, this is something that Anne-Marie brought up before our panel, the idea of the goal, the kind of career goal or the dream. Was working in-house always the goal for you?
Yeah, for me it was. I'd always wanted to be part of an audio team, like Cedar was saying before, and have that experience and learning from others. Especially, I think when you start as a freelancer, it's a really good thing to get in-house somewhere and with other people and get those extra opinions and that feedback to grow yourself and get better in your own skills. So that was always the goal for me. Yeah.
What about you, Anne-Marie? I feel like you have the most eclectic portfolio.
Like in terms of getting started, or?
Yeah, maybe. I guess I'm interested in, it sounds like freelance is where you want to be right now. Was that always the case?
Well, I mean, I didn't really, I did really like being in-house for a long time, and I do think it is often the goal because, and I often want to go back into it because there is financial security in being in-house. It's usually salary, and I think that's why a lot of people like the idea of it. Being freelance is a little bit scary, and there is also, I think, a little bit of prestige maybe attached to being in-house in that, like you said, it takes time to build up your brand, but until you have that, you go to events, it's really good if you can say, I work with X company. People sort of immediately know, who you are and what you do, and yeah, so I think it is still really good in that respect. Yeah, I don't really have much more to say on that.
I wonder, got another question from the audience here. Do you think there's a difference between music composition and sound design in terms of what in-house looks like versus freelance?
Composing my answer.
Because you've worked across both composition
I have,
and
yeah.
sound
So
design.
I do probably 50% composition and sound design generally throughout the second half of my career. And so is there a difference in what they look like in-house compared to freelancing?
Compared to each other?
Compared to
in-house?
each other, yeah.
And then also, let me double check the wording here. Let's start with how they look compared to each other in-house.
Sure. Yeah, so
We can
in-house
debate it
compared to
later.
each other, yeah, I feel that I can talk about that one. Yes, I think they're quite different. I think there is a lot more sort of, air quotes, creativity, which is sort of attached to the composing process. And it feels like when you're composing in-house, I think that's the time when I really feel like this eclectic, arty, creative kind of person who's off doing the weird thing that nobody knows about, as opposed to sound design, when it's a lot more sort of integrated with the teams, and it's sort of tracked at a much more granular level as well. So you're just working through your sounds. Everybody knows you're making sound effects for this and then that and everything. You track it all through. It goes in. You work with the team to implement it. It feels like a lot more regular game dev, I suppose. Whereas a lot of the time, I think the composition process feels a little bit more like airy-fairy, for want of a better term, and can be harder to quantify as well. And it's probably not helped by the fact that sometimes if inspiration strikes, you know, you might come up with a track in a day or two, and sometimes if it doesn't strike, embarrassingly, it might take a month or something like that. And so trying to kind of justify that to the people that you're working with or working for can be quite interesting as well, especially when you're trying to, you know, plan your time accordingly. And you sort of say, well, I think we might need to leave 3 months for music. And they say, but last time it took you 2 days. And so,
and you're like, yeah, I love that. Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah, and so I guess there's an element of trust there as well. And obviously you need to kind of earn that trust as you go as well.
That was a really good answer, yeah. Sure. I mean, I don't have too much to add to that. I think that was a really good answer. You know, the sound designers are often the ones who are doing more of the technical stuff. For instance, currently we're sort of setting up a lot of musical transitions in levels and things like that, even though we do have an in-house composer. He does help with that, of course. But, you know, we're often doing the more technical jobs and you know, he's, you know, playing with guitars and stuff like that, which is cool. It's both really good fun. But yeah, I think, you know, Cedar gave a really good answer before.
Yeah, covered it perfectly, I think.
So in terms of, we've got a question here kind of about specialisation. Do you think that having both music and sound design in your portfolio can weaken your chances as you aren't specialising in one specific thing?
I would say it depends if you want to do indie or AAA. Like, if you're really interested in being attached to indie studios, it's good if you can do a little bit of everything because they often can't afford to have both. They want some, and they also don't want to think about it a lot of time. They just want to have one person they farm their audio out to who takes care of everything. But in AAA, they're 100% about specialization. You want, you know, if you are a musician, you don't just want a composer. You want like specifically a jazz composer or specifically, you know, someone who's good at a genre or someone who's even just good at mixing. The big studios will have someone that's just their job, mixing. You know, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer. Even sound designers nowadays can get very specific in what they're looking for. So they might want like, you know, subsections of like maybe an audio programmer or a technical sound designer. Those are all separate roles as well that are available, particularly in AAA. Yeah, as Anne-Marie said, you know, indie often can do both. But yeah, if you were going to apply for a AAA studio or a larger studio, you know, of those AA sort of size, definitely try and be specific. If you're doing sound design, don't have music in your sound design reel. That's very important. Just do it purely sound design or purely music. You can have, you know, 2 separate demo reels if you wanted to, but I would try and segment them as much as I can. Maybe even, you know, like a separate website that's, you know, like one version is your sound design website that you send for sound design jobs, and one version might be your composition website that you send for composition jobs potentially.
That's really interesting, Scott, and definitely not to you know, take away from what you're saying, but I guess my experience has been a little bit different. When we hired new audio people at Halfbrick, for example, we did 4 hires over the years that I was there, and a lot of the time I did find myself you know, going through reels that would combine music and sound design. But that is obviously a particular position and at a particular company as well, and it was a very generalist kind of position that we were looking to fill. So we would look for somebody who had that, you know, composing and sound design type skills. And so, like Anne-Marie said, if it's a bigger company, and like you said too, Scott, then I guess that's when when the specialist stuff starts really coming into play a lot more. I would say, from my perspective, for the kind of games we were doing at Halfbrick, say. It was a big plus to have some sort of composition knowledge, even if it was a sound design position, because the nature of sound design is that, often you'll have tonal type sounds depending on the kind of projects you're working on, and then it's really important to have at least some sort of musical foundation there. So I think it doesn't hurt to show it, but obviously, your mileage may vary. Obviously, you've had a bit of a different kind of experience there, Scott.
Yeah, so maybe if I just add a little to that, I think, that's really cool. But I think the key thing is make sure that your both aspects of your work are given space to shine for the type of position you're applying for. And, as you said, if you're applying at half brick, it would probably be in the job description that they're the sort of things you're looking for.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. You have to make it right for the job application.
Exactly. Yeah. So tailor your application, and make sure if you're wanting to do sound design, that your sound design is strong enough that it's not going to the other way around. But make sure you've got strong sound design, and your composition, if you are going to include it, wouldn't bring that sound design down. Don't have a weak side of your reel if you're going to go that way, I guess. Yeah.
And don't introduce yourself as DJ so-and-so in your application, which we had some of.
Wow, that's bold. You didn't want to work with
For a
DJ
sound
so-and-so?
design role.
It's crazy. You've kind of spoken a bit about the positives about working in a team, but we have a question here about the negatives. How do you navigate egos and insecurities working alongside others?
That's an awesome question. Anne-Marie, why don't you go?
Yeah. Just grin and bear it.
Yeah, no, that's such a good question. I don't think that gets asked very much. I think there's definitely a skill in navigating feedback, in both giving and receiving good feedback. And yeah, it's an important one too, isn't it? Something that we used to do that I was a fan of would be to make it compulsory to provide negative feedback when we had feedback sessions. And by making it compulsory, then it kind of takes away any nastiness from it, So we had good sort of mileage from that. I'd love to hand the mic over to somebody else.
Yeah, so it is a really tricky question, and it doesn't get asked a lot. Especially as sound designers and composers, you're going to receive a lot of both positive and negative feedback constantly throughout your career. So it is important. I think a good approach that I've used with varying success, you might have heard it before, it's called the sandwich approach, right? So you start with something good, then you have the things to fix up, or the negatives in the middle, and then you might end with something else that you liked again, right? And I think that's a good way, because there should always be, unless you're doing the purely negative thing, right, with Cedar before, but there should always be something good that you can find in any piece of work, right? And I think it's important to both highlight the things that someone is doing right and the areas that may need to come up to scratch a little bit more to get the most out of someone. And it is important to do that in a very it differs from individual to individual. You need to know who you're giving feedback to, how they can take feedback, and what's going to work for each person, I think, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of a particular skill, I imagine, if you're working freelance, though, working with new teams pretty frequently.
I love negative feedback because it means that they paid attention and that they had usually something useful to say. And guarantee, I've never gotten negative feedback that I hadn't already secretly thought myself. And it's quite nice to have that outside perspective. In fact, I think feedback in general in audio is amazing. I think you'll find it's actually really hard to get feedback from a team. Unless they're paying you when you're a freelance, then sometimes not even then. And but I think maybe the question was it necessarily about feedback or managing being in a team?
Insecurities and egos.
Yeah. So I mean, that's just people management, right? It's a soft skill that maybe not all of us naturally have, and you just kind of have to work at it. You pick your battles. If you're at a big company, there's HR teams that sometimes help. But I think, we have worked with a couple of difficult people in the past, but we just sort of grin and bear it.
Yeah.
It's office politics are a thing, and I don't think you ever escape them. But if it's bad, leave. If it's fine, you just kind of learn to manage. Artists are notoriously sensitive people, I guess, and I don't have a golden bullet for that.
It becomes really sort of acute as well, doesn't it? Because we're working on such creative stuff, and so much sound design is highly creative. Music's almost always highly creative, and so this is kind of our baby. And so when feedback comes in, even if it's from your own audio team, for example, and maybe especially if it is, because they're all experienced and they know what they're talking about, yeah, like it's really hard to navigate. And I think that's a big part of getting along well with other people in that team environment is doing that in a productive way that ultimately serves the company. Something we always look at is, you know, what's going to be the best outcome here for the team or the developer. And, you know, kind of having that shared sense of mutual purpose, I think, can be really beneficial in those situations as well.
I would say one thing that's helpful is if there is actually a very clear like hierarchy, so that when those conflicts happen, you just sort of know this comes. I think there was one case, there was, I think the creative director of a team really wanted what I thought was quite a terrible sound effect in the game. And he was really attached to it. And so we're just like, well, he pays the bills, so technically we just got to live with that one. And when you have that sort of very clear line of command, you can sort of deal with those ego problems because you're like, well, that's the rules. You can just fall back on that and it bothers you a lot less.
Yeah. This might be something I can actually offer some advice on as well. Not specific to music, but definitely to working in creative teams. If you're getting a really unreasonable request, come back with 3 options. The thing you want to do, the thing they want to do, the thing you want to do and the problems it solves, the things they want to do, the problems it solves, and the stuff you can't do if you do that thing. And then a third secret thing. Just because I think creative people often get really, it's like a good and bad thing about creative people. They get very focused. They get very, very focused on their vision. And I think when you lay things out in quite a practical way like that, it can kind of jolt people out of like a very hyper-focused pattern and help them see the project more holistically again. The other thing I would say is you don't have to respond straight away, particularly to criticism. You can say, thanks, that's really interesting feedback, I've got to think about that. Or I'm going to follow this up with you later. If you find yourself feeling hurt or defensive, I highly recommend saying that instead of going like, oh, no, it's actually great, and I'm going to spend the next 25 minutes telling you why. Which is a huge problem I had early in my career that I have started to get over now.
I'm not super good at thinking on my feet. So like when I sort of learn to tell people, it's like, oh, okay, I'll take that on board and I'll think about it. Now I come back to you in an hour. That was a really good technique for handling that because it would give me time to process it, internalize it, and actually figure out what I want to say and, you know, the correct answer.
And probably a much more productive outcome too, I imagine.
Yes.
Yeah. Cedar, you mentioned earlier that it's tricky working as a composer because that creative process can be kind of difficult maybe to communicate to a team of game devs who are working on strict timelines. I wonder if you had, slightly outside of sound design, but I wonder if you had advice for, you know, young composers or composers who haven't worked with game devs before on that kind of communication side of things.
I think it's really important to try to take this like dark art of composing and try to break it up into sort of illustrate it as a process that other people can understand a little bit more if they're not from a musical background. So that might mean, you know, taking a track and thinking about, well, what is the full process here? Maybe we start with like figuring out a music tone and references and things like that. And we kind of, you know, plan out the feel of the track, and maybe then we start thinking about structure and length and everything, and then you go into all your musical elements and so on. And basically just kind of breaking it down a little bit more granularly into blocks so that other people can sort of understand it more, and it's not just this big cloud of you know, what is it that this person's doing. But sorry, the rest of your question, so about talking with them about the length of time that it takes, was it?
Oh, I just kind of in communication in general, I guess.
Yeah,
in that
okay.
cross-disciplinary way.
Yeah, and so for music, we always come back to just talking about how it feels and trying to speak in terms of not trying to give somebody the solution. So if somebody's giving feedback on music, or if I'm giving feedback on music, I'll try to normally talk about maybe like the problem, this feels too happy, it feels too sad, instead of saying, oh, I don't think you should have that major third in that track or something like that. And that way it leaves the composer room to go out and do their thing. rather than me sort of hand-holding and micromanaging or something like that. And likewise, when people are talking to me, I try to talk to them in terms of, well, can you tell me how it feels, and is it not how it should feel to you? And then after that, we can go and use our musical knowledge, I suppose, or our tools that are available to us to kind of translate that feedback into something that we can work with. And then even better if you can make it like an actionable task that you can show them and say, see, this is what I'm doing. That's why it takes a week or something like that. Yeah.
Another one from the audience. Oh wow, lots of questions. Chatty group. It's so funny dealing. This is the first time I've done like digital Q&A, and so like from up here, you're quiet, but in here, you're popping off.
They're all on their phones all the time.
Yeah. Classic gamers. Given that you have kind of come from a mix of in-house, freelance, contract work, what are your thoughts on in-house contracts that preclude you from doing other freelance work on other games?
Cedar, you should have something interesting to say about this.
Well, when I worked on Phantom Abyss recently, suffice to say, I was extremely appreciative that Halfbrick were okay with me doing that, and that I felt that it didn't put a black mark against my name or anything like that. It's definitely not the norm, I would say. Maybe it depends a lot on the company, probably, and a lot of legal structures and things like that. In my experience, it hasn't been the norm, so I absolutely loved being able to do it, and I'm convinced that the skills that I picked up came back to benefit the company anyway, and they certainly benefited my growth as a sound designer, composer, and all that sort of stuff.
It is getting more common, I think, that companies are quite happy for you to do things on the side, but that did not really used to be the case. Like, I think Chrome was quite strict about it back in the day. Well, not so much strict, but they sort of wanted right of first refusal. So if you worked on anything, you kind of had to ask permission.
And you can totally understand that as well, the reason behind that. Sorry. 2 mics and 3 people.
I know, it's a bit rude.
No, that's all right.
No, go on.
Let's say the same thing.
Yeah, for our friends
You
at
can
home.
totally understand that. It's fair enough. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think in terms of maybe like how to feel about it, if that's kind of what you're asking, like should I be upset, about this? I'd say no. I think it's a pretty reasonable thing for particularly bigger companies to ask. They don't want the people that are working for them to be burnt out or something like that. As the others have said, it is becoming a lot more common, particularly with smaller independent companies. They'll often be a lot more flexible, particularly if you're only working, if you're working like on a project and it's like 1 to 2 days work a week sort of thing, and you're not like a full-time contractor. I'd say you definitely should expect to be able to do other work on the side. How are you going to survive? And I think what's important is how you communicate with the company and say, look, this is my situation. This is what I want to do, this is why I want to do it, and this is why it's not going to impact you and it may even benefit you. I think opening that dialogue is a good place to start. And I think that's what's really important.
The flip side of that is if you are in-house, you really have to consider if you can afford the time to have a side gig, because that's a full-time job and then another gig on top of that. How did you handle that? Like it's a lot, right?
It is a lot, yeah. And I think it's something where it becomes a lot easier if you're passionate about what you're doing. So if you're working full-time in-house, you're probably not going to take on a side freelance project unless it's like a passion project essentially, and something that you're really interested in. And so in my case, I guess I just had to embrace that passion, to put all those extra hours in. And there's always going to be a crossover of tools and techniques that you learn and things like that. So the two kind of do, what's the word? They play nicely together a lot of the time as well.
It's actually a very natural lead on from that one. From Angus, can freelancers ever take a holiday?
I mean, you have to charge a rate that lets you afford to take time off is the answer. Whether or not you will is down to your strengths in planning and I think strength of will. There is this, when you're freelance, there's this kind of weird guilt of any time off you're taking, I'm not earning money, I'm not doing the hustle, I'm not working on that next gig. But it is really important that you schedule time off and you take it, because you will burn out if you just work full time. Same as if you were in-house and you never took holidays. It's the exact same feeling. So it's worth remembering. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just add on that a little bit more, I think it's really important to take a break from work in general. We are sound designers, we are composers, we're very passionate, we love what we do, we're game devs, but it is very important for mental health and your physical health sometimes too, to separate that, take your breaks, take your half an hour during the day. Don't work over your lunch breaks if you can avoid it. Make sure when you finish your work day, you shut the work door, and that's kind of it. Take some time out for yourself. It is really important. Yeah.
That is so true. Yeah, that's very well said, I think, because we love what we do so much. It's so easy to pull a late night just because you're wrapped up in whatever you're working on, and at the end of the day, you've got to be able to do it all again the next day, and sooner or later it'll catch up with you. Yeah.
I think we only have time for one more of these many excellent questions. So I thought I would go for the most upvoted one, which is a little bit more on the craft side of things, which is nice, because we've talked very practically so far. When you're approaching a sound design project, are you mostly working with synthesizers, recording or sampling real-world sounds, or a combination thereof?
Definitely a combination, and it definitely depends on the project a lot as well. Some projects, if it's a small, smart, casual game, for example, it might have a really musical type of sound design. There's going to be a lot of synth-based work in that case. But yeah, like a lot of them will rely heavily on library type sounds as well, where you'd always sort of supplement it with custom stuff wherever you can. For me, a lot of synthetic stuff, a lot of synth sounds, except for like obvious real world type sounds.
I have a follow-up that I want you all to answer as well. Have you ever used a sound in a way that surprised you, or like you used a sample that you were like, wow, who would have thought?
Yeah, definitely. I think I'm sure everybody in the audience has these stories too. It's part of the fun of the job. Yeah. For me, it was lots of them, of course, but like rubbing goggles as a vocal sound, like rubber goggles, rubbing that as a vocal sound for a dolphin. Gorgeous.
For me, I had a really cool one. There was I was doing a shot, and it was like a slow-mo sort of sniper bullet going through the air and sort of striking this guy, right? And so I decided, how am I I want to really create like a sound for this bullet. And so I grabbed a plate and I grabbed a knife, and my fiance was not very happy with me. And I scratched the knife, and that was the sort of the bullet sort of spiraling through the air with some processing and stuff as well, of course. But yeah, that was pretty good fun.
Fingernails down the blackboard.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Oh God, I don't know too many. Try to think of, I guess I think there was once where I had to do footsteps for like cake fondant. And I think I used like a styrofoam for that, as in like, but like as the squishy kind, and I would simulate footsteps with that. That's probably my most interesting one I can think of off the top of my head.
Incredible.
I had to make a looping sound for a cloud once.
Tell me more.
So that was one of the ones with the synth, so like an airy synth kind of sound. And in that case, you're like, well, okay, I think this cloud is going to be just a little bit musical, just so we can get by.
Incredible. On Thirsty Suitors, are you working mostly with synths, samples, real-world samples,
everything.
combination?
100% everything. Like, it's got a really strong anime influence. So, if you've noticed, anime uses quite terrible synths. Like, as in, like, that's sort of a little bit of the signature sound of it. But there's also a lot of stuff like there's a whole skating section, and which was meant to be a very small part of the game, became a very big part of the game. I had to go buy a skateboard and record that, and so it's everything. It's a I wouldn't say an even mix. I prefer actually analog sort of. I love custom recording where I can, but I'm not as strong in the synth side of things. But there's quite a lot of that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say you're using everything but the kitchen sink, but according to Scott, you're also using the kitchen sink. All right, I think we have to leave it there, but Cedar, Scott, Anne-Marie, thank you so much for this excellent panel.
Thank you.